Good evening. I'm Bruce Goldberger, and along with Kim Morgan, I chair the Student Advisory Committee of the Institute of Politics. Only 2 years ago, as a freshman, I sat out in the audience as you are tonight and wondered how I could get involved in politics at Harvard in a meaningful way. I have found in the IOP a center devoted to cultivating student interest in politics. The student program has often been described as the heartbeat of the IOP, and I'm sure that the fellows who are seated right here, whom you'll meet tonight and in the coming months, would agree. Under the different programs that we have created over the years, students are able to learn about politics, current issues and practices from many of the individuals who are shaping them today. Whether your interest is limited taxation, abortion policy, the environment, or the disabled, the IOP is the place for you. Created with an undergraduate focus, the IOP has evolved into also providing many opportunities for graduate student involvement. I'd like to invite all of you to find out how you can get involved during our reception tonight, and that's going to be in the IOP right through those double doors to my left. Talking about housing policy with the mayor of Yonkers, or learning about campaign advertising from Ronald Reagan's Media Whiz has certainly added to my undergraduate experience as much as any class I've taken at Harvard. We are a diverse group of students, and we could use your input. Now, in addition to making a pitch for the student program tonight, I have the distinct honor of introducing our director, Charles Royer, who in turn will introduce possibly the most diverse group of fellows we've ever been able to persuade to come up here and be in residence with us. Charles Royer comes to us as the 3-term former mayor of Seattle. As his predecessor, Dick Thornburg, once said to me, there's a big difference between a former mayor and an ex-mayor. A former mayor is someone who holds an office, holds the office again, and then decides that it's time to move on, while an ex-mayor is someone who kind of would have liked to keep holding that office, and his constituents don't agree with him. Now, as you'll hear from Mayor Royer's credentials, it's obvious why he falls into the former category. He is a former president of the National League of Cities and a recipient of the National Urban Coalition's Distinguished Mayor Award. He is a great choice for director, as he is the first one to hail from the West, and is also the first with such direct local involvement, which are indicators that the IOP has grown since its days as a stopping point for mainly Washington officials. Instead, Mayor Royer comes from a Washington that has been less frequently represented at the IOP. He has been a leader in important policy areas, doing extensive work in areas such as homelessness and teen pregnancy. Starting his career as a journalist and commentator on Seattle's nightly news, Mayor Royer was awarded for distinguished reporting by the American Political Science Association. And I can personally say that in the short time that I've watched Charlie Royer adjust to Boston housing prices and to his newfound anonymity, I've had the pleasure of getting to know him as a friend. His wit and warmth have already proven to be a great asset to the IOP, and I'm really excited about the coming few years. It's my privilege to mark the formal debut of the man who left Seattle what Rand McNally calls the most livable city in America, Mayor Charlie Royer.
Thank you, Bruce. I just love these Harvard students. They read those introductions exactly as they're written by the press. Exactly as written. Thank you very much, Bruce. And good evening, everyone. I'm very pleased to be launched by the chair of our Student Advisory Committee on this maiden voyage in the forum. And I can't go a step further without recognizing the person who, in this interim period, which proved to be longer, I think, and less interim than perhaps was comfortable or helpful for her, but she did an outstanding job for us, and that is Professor Shirley Williams, who is with us today. I've watched Shirley preside from this podium several times, and I've learned a lot from her, and so I also know you're supposed to be brief up here and to the point and get to the meat of the program as rapidly as one can. I'm very pleased to be here. I'm very excited at the prospect of working with this Student Advisory Committee. These students are absolutely outstanding. They work very hard to help us achieve our mission, which, simply put, is to provide the opportunity for people to be inspired about politics and public service. And one of the ways we deliver that inspiration is through the group of fellows who come to be with us for a semester. And as Bruce said, this semester we have a really interesting and diverse group, which I think you will agree is going to be a credit to the Institute of Politics. And they're interested in being with you in a one-on-one situation in the study groups which they'll be leading. I'm going to begin by introducing our first speaker, and we reversed the alphabetical order just to be contrary, and we'll start at with the W's, and I will introduce each fellow to you briefly. First to speak will be Jesse White, who is most recently Executive Director of the Southern Growth Policies Board. That's an organization which worked for 14 Southern governors. Former Director of the Office of Policy Development for Post-Secondary Education, the United States Department of Education. He served as Special Assistant to United States Senator John Stennis. He's run a campaign. He's been in the trenches, the political trenches, as campaign director for William Winter, who was a fellow here at the IOP previously, the governor of Mississippi. And his study group will be entitled Electoral Politics Southern Style, a hot issue for the country. Please welcome Jesse White.
Well, I wasn't in it. Thank you, Charlie. Upon opening my mouth, you will cease wondering why I chose the American South as the topic of my study group. My accent has already survived one stint in Cambridge at that other school on the Charles, where I did my graduate work, and I sympathize for those of you who couldn't be admitted to MIT and had to come to Harvard. But we will see how well my accent fares during this semester at Harvard. You know, we Southerners are prone to some exaggeration, and as I try to convince you that my study group will be the best in the history of the Institute of Politics, I might ask you to remember the story of Rosie O'Grady. Rosie was a student in the anatomy class at the University of Glasgow. And the professor walked in with the question of the day, and the question was this: what human organ can expand to 6 times its normal size? And he looked across the room and said, Rosie O'Grady, calling on you today. Well, Rosie got red-faced, said, no, Professor, I can no answer that question. They persisted, and she refused to answer it. And finally, the professor said, okay, I'll have to answer it for you, Rosie. The answer is the pupil of the human eye. When it goes from darkness into light, it can expand to 6 times its normal size. And I've got 3 things to say to you, Rosie O'Grady. 1, you did not study your lesson. 2, you've got a dirty mind, Rosie O'Grady. And 3, you're damned to a life of disappointment. And so, if I am prone to some exaggeration, remember Rosie O'Grady. I come to the IOP with a dual set of interests. One is in electoral politics, as Charlie Royer said, and the other, and that comes from my experience as a campaign manager in the trenches, and also my academic training, which was on the electoral side of politics as a political scientist, and also my work at the Southern Growth Policies Board at the Department of Education on public policy issues for about the last 10 years. I must confess that returning to Rosie O'Grady's study of anatomy, however, that deep inside my chest beats the true heart of a political junkie and a campaign activist. It's just hard to make a living doing that when you get to be past 40. And so what I come to the Institute interested in is studying and discussing with those of you who are interested in the South, and I hope that will be many from outside the region because it's so critical to American politics, the sort of interesting development politics that has emerged in the region over the last 20 years, which has produced a new type of candidate, a new set of issues, and a new type of office holder. But I don't want to talk too much about the discussion group itself. I invite you to come see what that's all about, but to talk a little bit about what we've asked to specifically address, and that is what motivates us to spend our lives in the political arena. I think the first and perhaps not surprising reason is that it occurred on the knee of my father, almost literally, who was deeply involved in Mississippi politics and served the state as insurance commissioner. And I remember animated political discussions around the dinner table, and I remember also very poignantly going to the state capitol and being swept away as a young lad with the grandeur of politics, which is a feeling I still feel when I'm around the political arena. Another reason, I think, another important event that got me involved in electoral politics was after I graduated from the University of Mississippi, and I have something to say about that in a minute also, I went to England for a couple of years, and in the summer in between, instead of traveling the continent with my fellow Marshall scholars, I came back to Mississippi to become involved in a gubernatorial campaign as a lowly researcher for the man, William Winter, who was eventually elected governor some, I guess, 12 years later when he finally had the wisdom to hire me as his manager. But during that summer, as a young man of 22, it dawned on me that work and pleasure that summer were indistinguishable. And when I got back to England, I thought about that a lot, and it occurred to me that that's kind of a good litmus test of what maybe you ought to do in life, is when working on Saturday and Sunday is the same as enjoying yourself on Saturday and Sunday. And so I decided to devote myself to a life of politics, and I'm kind of an odd bird in that I took the academic route and got a PhD in it, but I really have spent most of my life in the trenches of campaigns and public policy. I also, when I graduated from the other school on the Charles, went back to Mississippi and was Secretary of the Senate, and that was an interesting experience. And then to sort of put a closed parentheses on that particular aspect of my life, I ascended from the clerk's well some 16 years ago to last year having the inestimable honor of addressing a joint session of the Mississippi legislature from the dais. And I reflected to the legislature, however, that my beginnings with the legislature weren't quite that lofty, because I remember as a young man of 27, when I was elected Secretary of the Senate, and looking about 16, I was trying to establish myself with these grizzly old Mississippi senators. And so I was, smoking cigars, wearing fake glasses, doing anything I could to sort of establish myself. And I had a desk on the side of the chamber where I directed the work of the staff. And one day during grave debate, the lieutenant governor at the time was William Winter. I had inherited the chair of the former lieutenant governor, and it was a high-back chair, a wonderful chair. I was reared back in it. And in the midst of grave debate, the casters on the chair slipped off of the plastic and dug into the carpet and proceeded to flip me back in a backward somersault, which would have been bad enough except it threw me into a garbage can. Whereupon Governor Winter gavelled the proceedings to a halt and asked the sergeant at arms to check after the welfare of the secretary. So there are a whole lot of contextual personal reasons that I am involved in politics, some of them not quite so elevated. But the second reason has to do with Darth Vader and Luke Skywalker, and you might say, well, what does he mean by that? And it occurred to me this is an interesting analogy about politics, because I have personally seen and to some degree felt both the dark power and the good power in American politics. Because getting back to the University of Mississippi, my freshman year was in 1962 when James Meredith integrated the university, and My orientation week was very similar to the orientation week that many of you are going through, except that it was accompanied by a full-scale riot in which 2 people were killed, a campus devastated, and a state's name ruined almost beyond repair. And in a chilling way that I will never forget, I saw firsthand the dark force of politics and its capacity to mobilize and destroy, even here in this great land of democracy. But on the other side of the equation, I've also seen the ennobling power of politics. I remember that from that debacle emerged some light, some hope. This man, William Winter, was one of them, and one reason I became so committed to him, because he came to Ole Miss and helped mobilize a group of students called the Mississippi Students for Responsible Citizenship to try to form a response to help lead the state out of that horrible era of racial politics. And he suffered 2 defeats running for governor almost solely on the basis of his liberalism on the race issue, and that's why my role in helping him finally get elected governor was probably the single most satisfying thing I've ever done. But I have seen it in men like Winter and other people in politics. I've seen the ennobling side of politics in the extraordinary summonsing of energy that you see in people, in a political campaign particularly, to serve a wider and deeper end than themselves, which is the mobilization of power for what we might call, or what the British call, the commonweal, that motivates me to spend my life in this arena. Having seen both the dark force and the light force, I guess I want to do all I can to help Luke Skywalker triumph in politics, but it is certainly not preordained that he shall. It will obviously take work. And I guess I would like to close with 3 or 4 somewhat random and cosmic observations that have absolutely nothing to do with anything else I've said, and simply have to do with the fact that I have an audience in front of me and a microphone in front of me, and that I'm on a platform at Harvard, and that I no longer work for all those politicians. So I'll leave you with 4 little bullets. The greatest legacy that Ronald Reagan left the nation, perhaps, was a brutalization of the notion of commonweal. 2, direct popular primaries are a failed experiment in American democracy. 3, the real problem with American democracy may lie with the sovereign itself, which is to say the people. And 4, the federal government is totally constipated and does little more than service the debt, invade small countries, and enrich defense contractors. And you all know the remedy for constipation. Well, since I'm out of time, I can't explore these 4 points, Charlie. But I'll leave them with you and invite you to our discussion group where they will be discussed Southern style.
Thank you, Rosie. The Rose, who will speak with us next, comes from one of the most beautiful places on the planet, a place that achieved independence in her lifetime. Rose Warahil is a former member of Parliament of Kenya, member of the Joint Assembly of African, Caribbean, Pacific, and European Economic Community, Branch Assistant Secretary of the ruling KANU Party, and Secretary of the party at the constituency level, a party official, a member of Parliament, and an economist. At the Institute, Rose will lead a study group entitled Development Strategies for the Future of Africa. Rose Warahil.
Thank you very much. Coming as far as I've come, very difficult to know what to say to students, particularly because I come from a different culture. If I mention names, most of them wouldn't mean very much to you. I hope that by the end of the semester that will have changed a bit. First of all, before I say about myself, I knew I was coming to the Institute of Politics, and everyone would wonder why I should pick the title of development. And what we do ourselves in our political meetings is to say that the only politics we have now is that of development, which is the idea I hope to share with you during the study group. The other perspective that I should mention, which maybe I can share with you on another day, has to do with education and the opportunity that somebody like me has, that I'm lucky I was born in this century and I didn't live in the last century, and that it is these education opportunities and the possibilities to develop that will help us consolidate our democracy. I do know that the press, especially foreign press, which is what you read, sometimes feels that what we do in our countries is not democracy. I come from a country with a one-party state. So when you say I'm a party official, I'm an official in a party which is the only ruling party in the country. At the same time, speaking to you as a woman, I couldn't help but say that if I was speaking to a gathering in my country, I would have been welcomed by singing by women, which is what women usually do. Women don't usually get to speak. We do the entertainment, as maybe Charles will tell you when he was in Kenya, and men do the talking. At the same time, speaking to a university audience is maybe a more serious or solemn opportunity. When I was a student myself, I was very involved in student politics, which is maybe where I should start. Got elected on the, what we call the principal, which would be your university president or rector, advisory committee, got on the faculty board committee, and eventually got elected, maybe as the first woman, to be one of the vice presidents in the entire student body. Politics at that time and later, because after that I went to work for my own university. I went to university in Uganda, and I went to work at the University of Nairobi, which was the only university in Kenya at the time, and became a senior administrator. After I had left and had been away about 3 years, I had been away long enough to be invited again to be on a presidential commission, which is allowed. Our universities are set up not by charter but by acts of parliament, which gives our president the power to visit and inspect the university. So I was back there again on a presidential committee. The aim of this committee was to stop student disturbances. So I had moved from being a university student to a university administrator to a visitor. And I thought about what you call academic freedom and the kind of experience I have had as a student and as a worker, and then having to tell the university that they can only exercise academic freedom with responsibility. So you do contradict yourself as you go along. I graduated with an honors degree in economics. There were very few of us then who had this kind of opportunity, which is why I had to go to university in Uganda. And as a university administrator, of course, I gained a lot of experience in management and in trying to apply skills. And I've always felt that women have to work that extra harder. It was when I was working as a university administrator that my boss said to me, that's the first time I had it said, that I thought I was as good as a man. He thought that was a compliment. I tried twice. Again, I'm talking about how great I feel to be here, because in my university you wouldn't get a chance at my age or at my level of work to have time to reflect, which is what I hope to do when I'm here. I tried twice to study for a second degree, and every time I got promoted to the next level, which was to show me that I had done well. So I became the first woman to become an assistant registrar, and then I became the first woman to be a senior assistant registrar, which is the third highest level in the university administration hierarchy. After 10 years, I thought I had given the best part of my life to that kind of work, and I decided to go and work in the private sector and got a job farthest from where I could prove that I wasn't trying to be as good as a man, I was just trying to be me. And working in the private sector was also going to help me be a bit more creative. University administrators do enable university education, believe it or not, but you spend a lot of time moving papers, and I wanted to be a little bit more creative. It was when I was working as a consultant that I became a member of the visiting committee of the university. I was a woman with 10 men. We were able to tour the whole of our country and produce a report which we hope put a stop to student disturbances. From there, in 1983, I was appointed to Parliament. I didn't run because I got appointed to one of the 12 seats we have in our Parliament, to which the President appoints people. He consults who he wants, and he makes the announcement the same day he announces his cabinet. My nomination, fortunately, increased the members of women members of Parliament to 3, and I served one term until 1988. My going to Parliament had created other opportunities for me because, by coincidence, Kenya was doing a great deal for women in preparation for the Women's Conference during the Women's Decade. And the ACP, or African, Caribbean, Pacific, and the European Community had just finished the aid agreement, which we call Lome. Lome is a town in Togo, but it's called the Lome Convention. It's named after Lome, where it is signed every 5 years. The Lome Convention had a small article on women, on how aid or development aid could reach the grassroots and assist the women. So my going to the assembly, again, had something to do with the general movement for concern for women. When I was there, I was able to prepare 2 reports, one on women and how they can be integrated. And my main point, which I had to make to my European colleagues, is that in Africa, women are integrated. We are so integrated, we do all the work. So the other point I wanted to make is that we did not want to do any more work, but we wanted more skills and technology and assistance to make our work less arduous and less tiring and less time-consuming. I was able, again, because Kenya is famous worldwide for having a very high rate of population growth, again, this becomes a plus point for me. I had the opportunity also to be appointed as rapporteur for the second time to prepare a report on population strategies and how, again, this could fit in with the Lome Convention. The one thing I felt at the end of these 2 reports was the gratitude, again, that the ACP, that is 66 countries within those regions, had a woman to speak for them. And by the time I left, I found that increasingly government delegations from other countries were beginning to include women. Now, I'll tell you more about my country and maybe myself another day. But I want to say that I have had a rare opportunity, as I have said. We have a population of 24 million people, 60% of who are under 20 at the moment. This population is going to be 35 million by the year 2000. We have serious problems of school leavers. Education is provided for 8 years, by which time children are aged between 14 and 15 years, and most of them have to leave school without skills. And to try and create incomes and some form of employment around their homes in the rural areas. So I would like to tell you that I'm willing to discuss anything that you may know about Kenya, because politicians boast about knowing everything, and I'll be prepared to answer any questions. But most of all, I'm here because I'd like also to improve my own skills. After all, everybody will know I've been to Harvard, and I'll have to have something to show for it, won't I?
Thank you, Rose. All right, now we're running a little behind, so let's punchy 5 to 7 minutes, and we'll get to these questions. I think people are very interested in talking with you. Joan Richmond is a woman who also has racked up a string of firsts. She was vice president of news coverage for CBS News, former vice president and director, executive producer of special events, CBS News, and former executive producer of the CBS Evening News. She has a broad background in television journalism, especially in covering political activities. Her campaign, or her study group, maybe it's a campaign, will be entitled Campaign 92, The Candidates in the Press. We generally have someone from journalism from the press in our group of fellows as part of the political system, and we're very pleased to have Joan Richmond with us. Please welcome Joan Richmond.
Don't mind if I stay here. Now I know why correspondents used to scream at me, "Can't you turn off the lights? Can't you turn off the lights?" all the time. Also, Charlie, the first great correspondent that I ever met, Charles Collingwood, told me there's only one thing you have to know in broadcasting: when to get on the air on time and get off the air on time. I'll try to keep the secret. My old friend and colleague Dan Rather said the other day, news is a passion, it isn't just a job. And he was right about that. Politics is also a passion, and it isn't just a job. If you happen to be somebody who has both of these passions, then you can become a political journalist. We happen to be very passionate types in our business. I was thinking about how I got started with all of this passion, and I realized that it probably happened when I was 13 years old, and my father and I were watching the 1952 political conventions on television. We watched it avidly. We argued like mad about it. I was for Adlai Stevenson. He was for Dwight Eisenhower. And especially, I was riveted by the television part of it, by the coverage itself. I found it compelling and mysterious, and I was hooked, I think, from then on. And luckily, I was able to pursue both interests. So now I've spent 28 years in the television news business, almost all of them at CBS News. And 20 of those years included actual coverage of electoral politics. Now, to put the beginning of this career in some perspective, in the dark ages, if you were a woman, you could only enter this business or most other businesses if you were a secretary. So that was okay with me. So when I graduated from college, I went back to secretarial school, to Miss Vanderschmidt's secretarial school. That was really her name. She loved me forever, too. The problem was I never quite could conquer shorthand, even from Ms. Vanderschmidt. So when I went to CBS, I failed the shorthand test at the personnel office. They were very disappointed, but they did not throw me out on the street. Instead, they sent me to do what they considered to be a very lowly job in the library. Of course, it turned out, I'm pleased to say, to be the best thing that ever happened to me. It was a job clipping newspapers for the morgue files, $69 a week. I didn't even mark the clippings. Someone else marked them. I just clipped them and filed them. But it was the research department for the entire company, and so it was the perfect entry-level job. I met everybody who worked there. I found out what everybody did, and I glommed on to the people that I wanted to work with in the future. So the point is, if you have a passion, you should pursue it no matter what you have to do to get it going. I'm skipping a few years, and by 1968, I had been a researcher on documentaries, and I had become the major researcher on the space program for CBS News, and I had had the good instinct to nail down a mentor who promoted me eventually to associate producer and finally to producer, and thereby I got to my first presidential campaign. 1968, I think, was the year that really proved a turning point in our recent history. The events of that year are still very fresh in my mind, and I suspect in a lot of other people's minds who lived through it. There was, of course, the early anti-war campaign of Eugene McCarthy. There was Lyndon Johnson's decision not to run for re-election. There was the tear gas, which I can still smell very clearly, and the bayonets on the streets of Chicago, which I can see very clearly at the Democratic Convention, and my friends and colleagues bleeding from head to toe. But, of course, all of those events were overshadowed and, in fact, shrouded in the tragedy of the assassinations of Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy. Those were excruciating times to live through, but memorable times. It seemed as if these passions that we shared had led us to some sort of disaster, and that the country might not really recover from that trauma. And yet, the last event that I covered in that same year, 1968, was the Christmas flight of Apollo 8 around the moon. That was the first time that man had ever seen the moon with his own eyes, and probably more important, it was the first time he had seen the planet Earth as a whole ball. And I think it really did begin to heal some of the wounds of that year, at least provided a temporary salve. I bring that up because I think that the story of Apollo 8 belongs in the recap of a political year, because politics includes more than just electoral campaigns, election campaigns. It includes everything in the society and indeed in the world that affects how we are governed. I've been lucky enough to witness and attempt to report and analyze on many of the events which have been woven into our political fabric in the last 28 years. Beginning with the death of John Fitzgerald Kennedy, which was reported by Walter Cronkite with a tear in his eye, to the only other time Walter ever had a tear in his eye. This was a happy tear, a different kind of tear, when man first landed on the moon. The tumultuous events during and surrounding the Vietnam War, starting with the early demonstrations, going finally to the day the prisoners of war returned home, and eventually to the day the Vietnam Memorial Wall was dedicated. Then there were the 444 days American hostages were held in Iran, and the other seemingly endless days during the hijacking of TWA Flight 847. Of course, there were a lot of joyous days, too. There was the return of the Polish Pope to his homeland, the bicentennial of our country, the first Earth Day, which we're about to celebrate the 20th anniversary of. I could go on. This could be an endless list of events, but I won't. Now, you've probably encountered all of these events in history class, but to me, they are very real and very recent, partly because there's almost nothing more energizing than seeing history pass before your eyes, except perhaps participating in it. You may know, I hope you know, that today happens by coincidence to be the 30th anniversary of the first sit-in at the all-white Woolworths counter in Greensboro, North Carolina. It's quite a remarkable day, and I saw on the news, incidentally, that the four gentlemen who did that returned to that counter today were served breakfast by the black vice president of Woolworths. 30 years ago on this day, I was a junior at Wellesley College. You know, it's a strange institution down the road here a bit. And shortly after the first sit-in, a few classmates and I gathered together and decided to do something which at that time seemed unheard of. We went and picketed in front of the Woolworths in the town of Wellesley. And we did that for a number of weeks until we literally got told, you can't do that anymore. And it does sound silly now, and it certainly does not sound brave, but at that time, it was, at least for us, a personal political act, which we each took on our own. And of course, for me, it was almost the last time I was able to do that, because journalists, as you know, are not permitted to participate directly in politics. Now, there's some politicians who might take issue with that point, but trust me on that. However, I want to tell you that because I want to urge you to participate yourselves. Do it now. Do it on anything that interests you. You'll never regret it, and you'll never forget it either. And as far as being a woman is concerned in this peculiar business that I'm in, I will just tell you one story. When I was the senior broadcast producer of all CBS News coverage of all live major news events, Spiro Agnew, he was the Vice President of the United States at one time, you know. He launched a vitriolic attack on the press. During one of his major speeches, Mr. Agnew said, quote, "A tiny and enclosed fraternity of privileged men," unquote, made all the critical decisions in television news. I was extremely insulted by this at the time. However, I outlasted Spiro Agnew by many years.
Our next fellow has been vice chairman of the Republican Party in a state just a little way down the road, Connecticut, state legislator in that state. She has served in the leadership in her state legislature, and she is very much involved in volunteer activities in her state. And in fact, her study group is entitled Volunteerism in the 90s, Reviving the Call to Public Service. Pauline Keyser.
Good evening. I'm here standing up because I needed to break, and you people have to sit the whole time, but when I get a chance to stand up in the middle, I will. And if you think sitting in front of Woolworth and Wellesley, Massachusetts is silly, try Colby College in Waterville, Maine. That was even more ridiculous. But that's exactly what happened at that period in time. I grew up about 10 miles west of Boston here in a small city named Waltham, and in a very traditional Yankee household. Now, I didn't sit at anybody's knee and hear about politics. I can distinctly remember my mother's feeling about politics and things like the League of Women Voters, etc. She had an uncle somewhere along in the family that had run for office, was mayor of that town, and I believe served in the Massachusetts State Legislature, who borrowed money from her family and never repaid it. So from that point on, politicians were absolutely terribly negative thing in our household. She had this similar disdain for baseball players. I can distinctly remember in the 50s the Red Sox players, Ted Williams, a few others that had, some brushes with the press at that particular period of time. Well, I've always been sort of independent and sort of spirited. So I grew up and I married a baseball coach whose idol was Ted Williams, and later on I became a politician. And until the day she died, she could never understand why I had done, well, at least the politician. Okay. My entry into politics followed a lengthy period of time where I raised 3 daughters, taught science to homebound students, and worked with pregnant teenagers for well over a decade. And I volunteered in many, many community groups at the time. And I had wonderful opportunities to learn about issues, get involved in them, get excited about them, and was involved in setting up the first shelter for abused women in the state of Connecticut. In fact, I think in the Northeast at the time. And I found myself one time marching for Wounded Knee in 1973 out in San Diego to the beat of a tom-tom, and some of these intriguing experiences that would never have happened if I hadn't been a volunteer in organizations like the YWCA and Girl Scouts. And I found that I really liked sitting on these boards and setting policy and speaking in public and making decisions and solving problems and bringing groups of people together to a consensus opinion. And it was a natural transition, I thought, to move into the political world. As I began to explore a run for the Connecticut State Legislature, I found that leadership, public service, and the desire to make a difference were not the prerequisites for running for public office. In our area of the state, the local politicos looked for someone who had a strong ethnic identity, preferably Polish, Irish, or Italian. They looked for somebody who had lived in the community almost since conception. They looked for someone who had oodles of relatives in the area, and they really were not looking at me. I had not lived there all that many years. I had no family except my immediate family, and I had no strong ethnic ties. But I wanted to run, and I thought one way to do this would be to have to wage a primary. Now, in our state, we have a very weird system of primaries. In this case, 5 people determined who was going to run for this position. 5 people met in a convention to determine who was going to sit in that legislative seat. And in order to primary, you had to have 20% of the delegates, or you needed 1. Well, unfortunately, at the same time I wanted to run, the person who was chairing the local town council decided that he wanted to run also. And I thought, now this town committee is not going to elect my delegates to this convention. We both sat on the town committee, but he'd been there a lot longer, and he had, quote, earned the right to run because he'd sat at the local government level. Sorry, Charlie, but I didn't think that was a prerequisite for serving at the state. And so I went to the town committee, and I said, look, I knew they were in a difficult position. I said, perhaps you would consider giving me 1 delegate, or 20% should I choose to primary. Well, that let them off the hook. They could vote for 4 of Andy's and 1 of mine and get out of a tight situation. They did. I was able to then primary, cleaned up in the primary with the help of about 200 volunteers, mostly from very non-political backgrounds, but we'd been used to organizing and used to running things. And I went on to win the first election. Now, without the primary, it would have been impossible to do that, and I squeaked in there with about 112 votes because I represented an area that was at least 2-to-1 Democrat to Republican voters. It was really a wonderful experience serving in the legislature. Served there for 8 years, and I would tell you all, if you ever get a chance to do it, just do it. It was like taking a giant course in everything. I mean, I did not gravitate towards human services, environment, education, the typical things that all the women legislators were supposed to go into. Instead, I sat on the transportation committee, and I learned things you wouldn't care to ever know again about truck weights and boats and everything else. But it's fascinating. Then I made sure I wanted to sit on one of the finance or one of the money committees, and I sat on the finance, revenue, and bonding committee, and I sat there for the entire 8 years because I got very involved in bonding and bonding issues, and I quickly learned that every department, every commissioner comes to the bonding committee. And that's where you really find out what long-range planning is in the state. Believe me, you don't find it out through state budgets or year-to-year legislative sessions. Now, we had a lot of fun in the legislature as well, and it was fun and educational for my family as well as for me and my friends. My friends got more involved in what was going on because they would read in the paper the name of someone they knew. Now, my kids liked it when things were going well. They didn't necessarily like it when someone was attacking their mother, and they didn't particularly like it when they had to assist in my campaigning. I can remember the first time I ran, I had them lined up in the backyard. Now, they were about 10 and 12 and 13 at the time, you know, just that kind of age you don't want to be in the spotlight. And I had a bright idea for a fundraiser called a Jogathon. And so I wanted them to run in the backyard, and I took my black and white camera, and I had them in shorts out there, and they're going to run, and they run 3 steps and stop, click. We did that for about an hour, and of course, they didn't like any of the pictures, but I used one anyway, and it said, "We're helping Mom run, ... for state representative." And to this day, they say, "Mother, I don't believe you made me do that." But I did. Anyway, about 8 years later, after I'd spent 6 in leadership, I really wanted another challenge. I wasn't bored. I still like setting public policy. I still like putting coalitions together, and I still like the issues. But I needed more of a challenge, and I wanted the competitive spirit of me thrives again, and my races had become easy victories, and I just needed a challenge. So I decided to run for Secretary of the State. Now, in our state, we have a state convention that nominates people, and usually the underticket is an afterthought. You know, the biggies get up there and they run for governor, and then they pick who's going to be on the state ticket. But the rules of the party do not say that. They say that each one is voted on separately. And so when we had 3 people running for governor, we had 1 person running for Secretary of the State. And I tailed around all over the state like they were running for governor. I was running for Secretary of the State, set a goal that when I went into that convention that I would have the support of all 3 without having to endorse any one of them ahead of time. Someone bet me that it couldn't be done. It was done, and it worked, and I became the nominee for Secretary of the State. And it's a good thing because the endorsed nominee for governor didn't win the primary, and the former fellow at this institute, Julie Balaga, did, and we went on to run in the general election. Needless to say, with a $350 million surplus and an strong incumbent governor, we didn't fare too well in that election, but both of us felt as women that it was well worth trying. It was the first time our party had put up a woman for governor, and the first time, indeed, that 2 women had even been on the ticket at the same time. After a brief teaching stint at an inner-city high school teaching science, which you always revert to the past from here and there, I ended up being the vice chairman of the Connecticut Republican Party. This was an all-time consuming job, all-purpose job, and I was the general manager as well. I did a lot of training of candidates. I was on the other side of the coin now instead of an elective office, and we went through the national election cycle. It was indeed very, very demanding and exciting. And that brought me to this point in time when that stint is over, and I'm now reflecting on where I go from here. I'm keeping one eye on 1990, which looks better all the time in Connecticut for Republicans. I'm also still very much involved in the volunteer community. And when I came here for my interview and talked with the students, and they grasped a hold of the idea of volunteerism and the whole spirit of giving back to the society some of the things that they have been fortunate to have, I felt really encouraged that there is indeed a new feeling about the next decade, and a new sense of purpose, a new sense that we must work together on things. So I'm delighted, absolutely delighted to be here. I welcome you all to come to the study group. I hope you'll also just stop by my office and come in and chat. I'm the kind of person that no matter what I'm doing, the pencil or the paper goes down and I'll chat for an hour. So stop by and say hello, and enjoy having us here as much as all of us will enjoy being with you. Thank you.
Our next fellow was involved in a volatile kind of politics, probably in a way, in many ways, much different from those described to you in Connecticut. His were carried out in Chile. Henro Ariagara was director of the opposition campaign opposing General Pinochet in the plebiscite vote of October 5th, 1988. He served as vice president of the National Christian Democratic Party. He's an author, a lawyer, former fellow of the Wilson Center at the Smithsonian in Washington. He served as president of Chile's cooperative radio in 1979-1989. His study group is entitled From Pinochet to Democracy. Henro Ariagara.
Well, a couple of years ago, we were invited with my wife to a cocktail in Washington. And suddenly appeared a man that was rather drunk, and he asked me, well, how do you feel in this country? And I say, well, I love the United States. I am so happy in this country. And the man turned to the next person and say, how can be happy with that accent? Well, in spite of my accent, I want to say that I am happy. And the theme of my study group will be From Pinochet to Democracy. I will try to be very objective, and I try to be, in a way, an academician. But I have to tell also that for myself, that period of the history of my country, of 16 years, is perhaps the most important period of my political life, and let me say also in the life of my family. It's very difficult for you in America, in North America, that you are so extremely lucky with your political institution to understand what it means to be a politician under a dictatorship of extreme brutality. For my generation, a military dictatorship was a very traumatic experience. When Pinochet came to power, I was 30 years old. Now I am 47 years old. Perhaps the time between 30 and 47 years in the life of a man or a woman is a very wonderful period, and it is strange that period you will be under this dictatorship. But in a way, I think that my generation paid a price of his arrogancy, because in the 60s and in the early 70s, we feel that we were the owner of the history of our country, and we attempt to make different kind of revolution, and by that way we become very intolerant, and we began to have no respect for legality, for our political adversaries, and the people that later become very close in the opposition, let me say, the leftist group that we are working with Salvador Allende, or with the Christian Democrat that works with Eduardo Frei, we are led to a kind of a political struggle in which we don't have respect for each other, and there was a lot of intolerance, a lot of division. We don't accept any kind of political compromise. And then when Pinochet came to power, in part is our sin, because a civilian society that divides himself in such a deep way is a civilian society that in a way is calling for the military intervention. And when the military men came to power, when Pinochet came to power, we suddenly discovered that we were reduced to the minimum. We, the people that were thinking in revolution that will change the face of the entire world, suddenly we were poor men and women without any right. Also, for the first 10 years of our struggle against Pinochet, we will feel very successful if we will have the right of habeas corpus, that is the right of a person to be put in trial and not be not be detained without putting that person in the hands of the justice. That is a right that the English people have since the 13th century, but we don't have that right for 10 years in our country. That is a kind of humiliation that means a dictatorship. When you realize that you began to destroy your university, but suddenly you have a military university, that the social scientists are fired from their position, that the unions are destroyed, that there is not any more free press, all those things. And in that moment, that was a terrible moment, we began to realize how important was the basic things of real democracy. And we began to be re-educated in the idea of tolerance, in the necessity of to share some common values that are more important than the programs or the ideologies of the political parties. And by that way, we began a long, long road that took 16 years trying to recover the idea of a free university, respect for the intellectual, the respect for human rights, basic human rights, the right to not be tortured also. And in that time, of course, it was for me was a tremendous experience. I was a political activist, I was a political scientist, and I was also a person in the mass media. But mostly I was a part of a very high number of persons that during the 16 years we were able to create in front of the military state our own country. If they were the owners of the police, we create very strong human rights groups. If they were the owners of the universities, we create small think tanks in which we were able to survive as writers, as political scientists, sociologists. If they were able to destroy the plebiscite, because I was the person that I have to inform the press and the country that we were the winner. But in that moment, I was thinking that people from abroad can say that that was the moment, and that wasn't. The real moment was that long, long road that we were able to go through that road. Also in those early days that we have the bitterness of the defeat in which we don't have hope. But in spite of that, we were able to have aim for the next day. And I think that as you talk, political life is a passion. Of course it is. I think that if it is not a passion, I cannot understand, not myself, because in a way I was more lucky than others, but such women or men of very poor condition that were fighting for some values in such a difficult situation. And that is perhaps the only explanation, is that the political life is a passion. And perhaps it's a very rewarding passion in times of difficulties, because those are moments in which you discover a lot of friendship between people that think in different ways, that believe in different political parties, or people that it's a great opportunity for for friendship. It's a great opportunity to know people of of courage, and also that are so decent in very difficult moments. But also, and I will finish immediately, I say that during those years I learned something that I want to tell you this night. The political life in a country is so important. It's so important. Sometimes people feel that democracy is like the love of your mother, something that always will be there. But they don't realize that political life is a difficult plant that cannot survive if the best people don't have some concern for politics, that don't have concern, that don't have time to be careful about what is going on in his country. And I hope that the study group that will work with me, I will try to share this idea of how important it is to have concern for political life. Thank you.
I wonder, did any of you think of that, the same line I did when Henro was talking about that period of young maturity and this enormous challenge rising to it? The quote from Justice Holmes, I think it was, who said, in our youth it was our great good fortune that our hearts were touched with fire. Clearly, it's our great good fortune to have Henro with us among these fine fellows. Steve Cobble was the person who counted delegates for Jesse Jackson at the Democratic National Convention. And he created a job for himself called Executive Director of the Keep Hope Alive PAC. Out of that is an advisor to Reverend Jackson and has been a special assistant to the office of the governor of former governor of New Mexico, Governor Anaya, in 1984 through 1986. He brings a very interesting, youthful political background to his study group, which will be entitled 1992 Presidential Politics, Republican Realignment, Democratic Comeback, or Rainbow Revolt. Lots of questions, and he has some answers. Please welcome Steve Cobble.
I suppose it's one of the luck of the draw that you get to go last and follow somebody who's lived the life that Henro has led. I'm reminded of an Iowa caucus day when I heard 5 of the best speeches I've ever heard in my life from all the Democratic candidates, and it was the way politics ought to be run. The entire community was there. They were picnicking. It's the kind of thing that Iowa and New Hampshire get that the rest of us never get to share. And halfway through Reverend Jackson's speech, which was one of the finest ones I've heard him give, it started to rain. And he finished, led the crowd in a few chants, as he always does, and then turned to Governor Caucus, who was the only one left to go, and said, "Don't worry, Governor." He looked up like he was looking to somebody and said, "It'll stop." And we all went under the shelter for about 2 minutes, and it stopped. Came back out, Governor Caucus walked up to the microphone and said, "Do I really have to go on now?" I feel a little bit like that right now. But being in a room with political experts, a mayor, and all of you as political activists, I was wondering if I could take care of some important business. Is there anybody here who can take care of this parking ticket for me? I am in Boston, right? Seriously, it's an honor to be here and I really do. I wish my mother was here right now. I wasn't always Jesse Jackson's delegate counter, or a Harvard fellow for that matter. 20 years ago today, as they say, I was on my way to being a mathematician, and I was sort of saved from that particular social abuse that young males give to each other when one member of their group happens to be kind of a nerd, by the fact that I could play a little basketball. That was the only thing that kept me. But I had, in those days, it was the slide rule on the belt, not the computer. I mean, that was the dark ages, right? But that was me, and I went off to college to be a National Merit Scholar in mathematics. And the Vietnam War came along, and I didn't like it much. And I don't know, as I said to the group yesterday, I don't know whether it brought my politics out or created them. But it brought me into protest politics, and it brought me into electoral politics. And mathematicians give corollaries all the time. So corollary number one is that, as Henro particularly just proved, politics matters and history matters, but political experts are made, they're not born. And to prove that, I guess, I'll offer you an example of how I became an expert. I was in New Mexico, an anti-war activist at a kind of a boondocks town. It was an ag college. It was the kind of place where when we demonstrated, we were glad the police were there because there were more cowboys than hippies or whatever, and we needed their protection. My standard look in those days was hair down to here, John Lennon glasses, you know, the work shirt. Not that I ever did any work, but the work shirt. The blue jeans, the thread belt, and the headband. And to this day, my mother can't understand why I'm not embarrassed by that. But I'm not. One Sunday morning in early 1972, I got a call from the state coordinator for George McGovern, who had gotten my name from a history professor that we both knew who was active in politics. And he wanted to know if I was interested in coordinating my county, which was the second biggest county in New Mexico. At that time, it had 24,000 voters. So, I mean, New Mexico's not a very big state, but this was a big-time county. And I wasn't sure I wanted to. I mean, it might be selling out. I wasn't quite. But I said I'd go meet him. And you picture the scene. It was this hotel room in Las Cruces, a Sunday morning. I walk in. I'm 20 years old, idealistic, untested, a self-proclaimed radical, a little bit of the intolerance Henro was talking about, a terrifying sight to grandmothers everywhere. In short, I was his worst nightmare walking through that door. He was unshaven. He was tired. He'd obviously been on the phone all night. He was an experienced political operative. He was a liberal, which in those days was, well, was sort of as disreputable as it is now, but from a different angle. And he was most of the way through a big bottle of vodka. So he wasn't exactly my dream date either. I mean, but he was desperate, and I was naive. I mean, McGovern was at about 1% in the polls then, so he couldn't be too choosy. So we agreed to give it a try. Now, the reason I'm telling you this is because at the time, being the political genius I was sure McGovern didn't have a chance. And my purpose in doing this was the strategic one of getting enough delegates to bargain with Ed Muskie when he won the inevitable nomination and force him to take a stronger anti-war platform at the convention. That was my goal in the whole thing. Well, then McGovern scared Muskie in New Hampshire, and he carried Massachusetts. He carried Wisconsin. He won my county, my state. He won the nomination. At the age of 20, I was elected a national convention delegate, one of the youngest ever, because we had just changed the party rules, so they took really young people too. And I was now a, quote, genius, unquote, because, of course, I had seen all this unfolding before anybody else had, and everybody said so. And in the time-honored tradition of experts everywhere, I never let on, and I proceeded to explain how what I had never predicted had actually come about, which is what you do to become an expert. Which leads me to corollary number 2, which is that all pundits should be required to bet their own money on their own predictions, which I think would help a lot with global warming myself. But unlike the sort of big chill mythology, I never gave it up. I mean, I had the passion that was spoken of earlier, and I've remained active for a generation, both electoral politics and single-issue politics. You name it, I probably marched for it or campaigned for it. And it's been a long 2 decades for us, sort of like being a Red Sox fan. But I do see a 1,000 points of light at the end of the tunnel. And I will give you one piece of useful advice here, which is sort of Cobble's corollary number 3. If you're going to be in politics, learn how to stack a caucus. I mean, that's actually a useful piece of information that all it requires is a telephone and some friends, and you can carry a lot of issues that you have no business carrying. Corollary number 4 is that people struggling for a kinder and gentler world is a necessary, and sometimes it's even a sufficient condition for social change. In many ways, I haven't grown up much. I still admire the Declaration of Independence, much of the Constitution, and the Bill of Rights. And what happened in Chile reminds me again of that. I still believe politics is about hope and vision, respect for the average person, the dreams of average people. It's about leadership. It's about the future. And little d democracy and nonviolent change, the reasons I got in. I'm not sure it's a rational belief, but I still believe that. I believe it can change lives for the better because I've seen it happen in my lifetime. At its best, it offers us common ground, community, and vision. It doesn't always have to be negative and fearful. It can be positive. If you get into it and your head's not on straight, it can mess up your life. It can take it over. It can take your flaws and magnify them, and we've seen some of that in recent years. But there's not much in life that's more exciting or inspiring, and when on those rare occasions when you win one, there's not much more satisfying. And I guess I'd end by saying that politics to me is Martin Luther King's voice and a drum major for justice. It's Bobby Kennedy and a tiny ripple of hope. And it's Jesse Jackson in front of 10,000 grown, white, adult Southwest Virginia coal miners and bringing them to tears, talking about John L. Lewis and Martin Luther King. Or bringing the hardened, cynical, jaundiced National Press Corps to tears while comforting AIDS patients in a clinic in Dallas, which I got to see. It's people struggling to keep hope alive for a generation after assassins' bullets took 2 of the most eloquent voices that this country's ever had. It's solidarity, changing the way we think about unions, the way the world works in politics, and hopefully making Polish jokes unfunny for the rest of our lives. It's common people waiting in line for hours to vote to oust dictators. It's women leaders becoming the symbols of change in just the last couple years. It's a wall coming down spontaneously. It's a poet and a playwright getting elected president of Czechoslovakia. It's an African American becoming governor of the capital of the Confederacy. And it's a student standing in front of a tank. In short, if we keep the right spirit about it, I think politics is a life with meaning.
Well, those are our fellows, and I think quite a group. Shirley, did they obey your time directives any better when you were? No. Okay. Well, we have some time for questions, so let's get started. I knew this would happen. Let me throw. Oh, here's one right here. Would you come? Great. Yes, sir.
Yes, my question is for Mr. White. As fellow Southerner, I'm really glad to see a Southerner here, and I think I'll enjoy your session. My question is about David Duke. Was his winning the election a fluke, or is it a trend that we may see going across the South, or in Louisiana at least?
Well, I think it's a fluke that bears close watching. I've been in Louisiana a fair amount recently. In fact, Governor Romer was my chairman this year, and talked to him and some others about it. And I think it's something that we need to keep our eye on, but I do think it's more of an aberration than a principal trend in Southern politics. But he is a very glib, persuasive man, and I think we ignore people like that at our own peril. Where are you from? Where are you from? Oh, okay.
Yes, sir.
I wanted to ask Mr. Herrera, where you think Chile will be going in terms of what the democratic forces have learned from the experience of the fall of Salvador Allende, and also what position General Pinochet, as he continues as head of the military forces in Chile, how dangerous that position is, and how precarious the new democracy is in Chile, in your opinion?
Well, let me make a very brief comment. In Chile, we don't have democracy. We have the chance to a pacific transition to democracy, and that is all. The situation is extremely difficult because we have, in one hand, looking to our strength, we have a very broad coalition that has been working together for a lot of years. We have the majority of the population, our support. But at the same time, we have a constitution that was tailored by Pinochet to his own. And according to that constitution, he will remain as commander-in-chief for 8 more years. And then we will look in the next year. Every transition to democracy is different one to another one, but this will be one extremely difficult in terms of in terms of the institutionality that the dictatorship has created. But in spite of that, I think that we have that we will win. We have won in the past in conditions in which nobody believed in us. I think that we will be able to have a peaceful transition to democracy and to consolidate a stable democracy in Chile in the next years.
Bruce.
Not to break a trend or anything, but this is also a question for Mr. Ariagara. And my question is, with you wanting so much to realize this dream for so long, being very glad that you've decided to spend the semester here with us, how did you decide that once kind of this dream that you've had finally looks like it may come to fruition, how have you been able to leave the country at such a kind of poignant time?
Well, that is a very personal question. No. Let me say, I think that these years we have in the short term a very, very difficult task. My point, and with the new President of the Republic, was saying, perhaps you have 4 or 5 main positions. And you have the person for that. And my friends, I support them, I believe and I trust in them. But also, it is necessary that after such a number of years, some of us take the opportunity to look the world from outside, because the world has changed. And we have been surrounding the Pinochet and the day after day the problem of the opposition, how to maintain the coalition unified. Then I think that for a politician, it's good to come to a place like this, because I think that during these 4 years, the transition to democracy in Chile will be a very difficult task, in which the agenda will be all those problems that we will inherit from Pinochet period. But in the next 4 years, we will have a new agenda, and we have to have more concern for those problems that you can look it better in this place than in my country. And that is a friendly conversation with the new President of the Republic, and he agreed with me, and I agree with him.
May I ask Steve Cobble a question? Has Jesse Jackson authorized you to say whether he will run for mayor?
Would the Boston Globe leave? No. I think, no, he hasn't authorized me, but based on the conversations he had last week with A.M. Rosenthal, the New York Times, and then the next day with Newsday, which were directly opposite of each other, I think it, assuming they quoted him right, of course, I think it's fair to say that Reverend Jackson has not decided what to do on running for mayor. And he is in the good position for himself of not having to decide as a political fact, because he already has carried the city in 2 elections. He has 99% name ID, has 87% favorability ratings, et cetera, which is not to say that you can't make political arguments for why he should announce tomorrow and go ahead and raise a bunch of money and steamroll everybody, which in fact I have done. But there are also arguments from those who care about them, including a former fellow here last year, I believe, Ron Walters, who suggested that it's a trap, that it's cleverly baited by people who hate his guts and want to get him in a position where he has lots of expectations and no resources, and people who don't like him control all the resources he's supposed to get, which of course means that they would like to see him fail. So his advisors are literally all over the board. And everybody has a different reason for the position that they have, whether it's to run or not run. There's not even a consensus on why yes or why no. And so I think it's going to be a process of waiting. And of course, the last thing I'd like to say is, if he had decided when everybody told him he should decide, which was last year, then he would have decided before recent events changed the equation and in some way made it more attractive for him to run, and the city, in a sense, needs him more now than it did a week ago. So Jesse has a very good sense of timing, whatever, and he's very accustomed to flux. And so I don't think you'll see a decision anytime soon.
Cobble's corollary number 5, keep your options open. Yeah, we have, we'll just take these 2 questions, then we have to conclude. Yes.
My question is really to any member of the panel today, but especially Mr. Herrera and Ms. Warahil. I'm wondering about the image of the United States in terms of world affairs. I mean, with friends of mine who are students at Harvard who are insulted that our ambassadors to their countries are qualified based upon checks for $150,000 to the Republican National Convention. And my experience of having sat in this audience a few weeks ago and watched foreign diplomats make jokes about the Vice President of the United States, and the idea that the United States would invade a neighboring country, a fellow American country, and that the popularity of the president would be increased by that act. I'm wondering how the rest of the world sees the United States in terms of its ability to take the moral high ground on serious issues and its ability to exercise the power that it has in the past in international affairs.
Well, first of all, let me say that I'm a guest in this country, and but secondly, although I'm here as an individual, it's very difficult, as you can see even when I speak, to really tear yourself away and behave as an individual, even in our own countries. And since we got independence in Kenya, we have been friends with the United States. We don't make secret about it. We have ourselves arrangements about our security, which even it's not discussed openly in Parliament. Even all the time, even when we pass budgets, we discuss everything else except security. And it's not up to me to say or to know what the arrangements are. At the same time, I can tell you that we get United States news nearly every day. I see your president on our national television nearly every day. And that's only one channel, which is a government channel. We don't have a second channel. We're hoping that this year we have enough commercial support to provide it. We are very aware, even in the rural areas, that this is the biggest nation on earth. That is the message we have. And we have, even before independence, benefited a great deal ourselves, not just in aid, but as I said, in education. Many of our Kenyans who are in government are beneficiaries of the airlifts, which were organized by the Kennedys, the Peace Corps, and other volunteers who work in our country. So those are the ordinary things that the ordinary person would know. When you get into more big issues about what positions you're taking about defense and your ability to go into other countries and do what you do, that is really beyond the judgment of the average Kenyan.
Question for Pauline Keyser, and I was just wondering, you had said in your speech that you see volunteerism as becoming a greater part of Americans' lives in the 1990s, and I was just wondering if you think that's true for all Americans, including the me generation yuppies, or is that just true for younger generations?
That's a very good question. I'm hopeful that it's going to be everybody involved in the new movement towards volunteerism. And I think you'll see, and we will explore in the study group, some of the new initiatives at the national level. I really have to think that President Bush and his wife Barbara have in some ways reincarnated this whole volunteer idea with the 1,000 Points of Light and the Office of National Service and stuff like that. I think that we had a generation that didn't do a lot of volunteerism. Maybe, and that's probably not your parents, probably just a little bit below where your parents are in age. And I think that they were trying to do everything focused on themselves. And I honestly think that the final crisis of the drug situation, everything else, has made people think, wait a minute, we have a very large, serious problem that we're going to all have to work together on. And one of the things I hope that we can explore and talk about is the fact that, to get out of the cage that we've always been on volunteerism with the haves helping the have-nots. I think we have to look at it in a broad context and say that volunteerism can be for everybody, because you also give and you receive from that as a very growth-oriented philosophy. And I think that once we get out of that mindset, it was of the person who, the idle rich who had time to go and volunteer and do something of that nature, to a broader perspective, which I think we are beginning to develop today, that we're going to be much better off as a nation. And we'll be exploring all that in the study group.
The Student Advisory Committee invites you to the living room over here of the IOP to meet our new fellows, get a chance to talk with them informally. And please join me in thanking them for a fine presentation this evening.